The book of Nehemiah records a story. A post-exilic Israel gathers to hear Ezra, the priest and scribe, read from the book of the law of Moses. He reads from early morning to midday in the presence of all who could understand. There are Levites present to guide and interpret as the crowd is moved to tears. It is a profound and emotional scene, perhaps one of my favorites in all of Holy Scripture. From the NRSV, and Nehemiah, who was the governor, and Ezra, the priest and scribe, and the Levites who taught the people, said to all the people, "This day is holy to the Lord your God. Do not mourn or weep." For all the people wept when they heard the words of the law. Then he said to them, "Go your way, eat the fat and drink sweet wine, and send portions of them to those for whom nothing is prepared. For this day is holy to the Lord our God. And do not be grieved, for the joy of the Lord is your strength." So the Levites stilled all the people, saying, "Be quiet, for this day is holy. Do not be grieved." And all the people went their way to eat and to drink and to send portions and to make great rejoicing, because they had understood the words that were declared to them. The hearing and understanding of Torah, read aloud in the midst of renewed hope, following despairing exile and oppression, moves the people to joyful praise and generous sharing. It uplifts and opens hearts to God and neighbor. It is a scene every flash mob or choreographed public proposal aspires to. Yet when I think of conversations I've had with so many of my fellow white Christians, mainline and otherwise, the experience of hearing or reading the 5 books of Moses is dramatically removed from this scene in Nehemiah. I've lost count of the amount of conversations I've had where someone tells me their read the Bible in a year plan broke down in Leviticus or Numbers. Perhaps the issue is the lack of quality interpretation and guidance, such as that provided by the Levites. We might not have had enough exposure or done enough close and careful reading to counteract the internalized supersessionist anti-Jewish attitudes our traditions have often dealt in. We might not have read deeply or widely enough to find the many gems obscured by cultural and historical gaps. Or perhaps distracted by the noise and speed of our culture, we might not have reached the requisite stillness to listen closely for the heart of Torah. And so we need to find faithful interpreters who can guide us in our journey into an enriched and expanded appreciation of the Torah, the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, from Genesis to Deuteronomy, the beginning of the cosmos to the edge of the promised land. And I'm excited because today I talked to one such interpreter. My name is Liam Miller. This is a special episode of the Love, Rinse, Repeat podcast, co-presented with Insights, the magazine of the Uniting Church in Australia's Synod, New South Wales and the ACT. It is also a special episode because my guest today is Rabbi Shai Held, theologian, scholar and educator, president, dean and chair in Jewish thought at Hadar, where he also directs the Center for Jewish Leadership and Ideas. He is also very understanding of people who mispronounce his name during interviews. Today we talk about his 2-volume, The Heart of Torah, released through the Jewish Publication Society, a book or 2 books that you need to put on your bookshelf right away. In the introduction he writes, "Writing these essays that make up these 2 volumes has been a labor of abiding love. It would be impossible for me to convey the joy and delight it took in producing them week after week. I pray that my love for Torah is evident in these essays. More than that, I pray that this love is contagious." Well, somebody call a doctor, because the dear rabbi's prayer came true. I caught the love. Friends, folks, welcome to Love, Rinse, Repeat, Rabbi Shai Held.
So one of the questions that I often like to ask is, someone who's looked at the stories in the Bible, so diligently and with such care and attention, is if any one of these stories, if you could greenlight any one of these stories to be a major Hollywood motion picture, I'm talking no budget spared, we can get any cast you want, any director, what story, what figure, what moment from the Torah do you want to see up on the big screen?
Wow, what an interesting and difficult question. I have a couple of immediate thoughts, which I will probably regret momentarily. But in terms of a drama, the first chapter of Exodus, in which if you read the text closely, it's clear that the narrator wants to construct this kind of massive dichotomy between Pharaoh as an agent of death and God as an agent of life, and thereby cast the story of the Israelite enslavement in Egypt as nothing less than a cosmic drama of life struggling against the forces of death. I think that just makes for an enormously powerful story with an infinite array of resonances. The second thought I had as you asked the question is very, very different, which is perhaps a surprising answer, but it occurs to me that one could make a very interesting imaginative film about the marriage of Isaac and Rebekah. I write in the Heart of Torah about how I think that Isaac actually tries to repair what is wrong with his father's relationship with his mother. That is, it seems as if Abraham is willing to imagine a world in which God's promises are fulfilled through him, but not through Sarah. And Isaac refuses that, right? Where Abraham prays for a child, Isaac prays in Rebekah's presence for Rebekah to have a child. Isaac, unlike his father and his son, is married to only one woman. I think there's actually a tremendous amount to say there, and it strikes me as one of the most kind of humanized portraits in the Bible. And Isaac, who is a person who is often given very little credit, sort of a placeholder between Abraham and Jacob, I think there are actually sides of him that are quite not only redeemable, but really worthy of emulation.
That's great. I've bought my ticket for both already. So if people are keen to make them, I'm keen to see them. Thank you for that. So having penned a work like this, some 600 plus pages on the 600,000 words of Torah, when you wrote it, like either when you were originally writing it or then bringing it together into the book, were there any kind of, I guess, standout surprises, either from investigating an individual portion or when you kind of sat back and looked at the whole? Were anything kind of like surprise you, come out of left field, in the process?
Well, I wrote these essays, it's maybe worth saying. These essays began as an email list, a distribution list. I wrote them one a week for 2 years. And, it's interesting how, some people will tell you that when they write a sermon, they start out knowing what they want to say, and they look for a textual peg on which to hang it. Consciously, at least, I started at the very opposite extreme. I would open the Torah portion, I would read it carefully, and note things about it that struck me as interesting. Things as small as why this Hebrew root versus that Hebrew root, and as large as how could God do such a thing. And what struck me only after completing 2 years of writing was how, despite kind of operating on a very local level, working inductively, right, from what the text led me to, nevertheless, there emerged over the course of these 2 years the contours of a biblical theology with some themes that returned again and again. And we know enough about hermeneutics by now to say that perhaps that isn't surprising, because after all, it is me reading the text. It is not the text reading itself. And yet I was struck by how much the essays hung together and how much when I turned them into a book, I found myself constantly providing the reader with, if you want to pursue this point, go back to this essay, look at these 4 essays for a similar theme. That was really striking to me as a writer, and the experience of writing and then looking back at what had emerged. Now, I think that there were many texts that I had not really understood. And I will say that something that I learned a great deal from and that I would actually recommend to writers in general is I made an effort in many of these essays specifically to write on the chapters that I felt I didn't have anything to say about. That is to say, I tried to wrestle with the text I found hardest. And, I came upon some extraordinarily beautiful things. I'll just give you one very concrete example that to me is one of the most important essays in the book, and I elaborate on it a great deal in a book that I'm working on now. In the book of Leviticus, there is the sacrifice of thanksgiving, the Korban Todah, which falls into a category of sacrifice, Zevach Hashlamim, the sacrifice of well-being. Sacrifices of well-being one has 3 days to consume the meat one has cooked. But the sacrifice of Thanksgiving, the Korban Todah, is exceptional. One must eat it on the night that one sacrifices it. Whatever is left by morning has to be burnt up. So I had been aware of this law, and honestly, it just struck me as a kind of obscure Levitical law. I didn't really have anything to make of it. And then it occurred to me as I was reading the chapter in Leviticus again, that much of the reading in philosophy journals I had done about gratitude actually explained what might be going on in this sacrifice, which is that a variety of philosophers argue that constitutive of gratitude is not just a feeling of being grateful, but an urge to either pay back or pay forward what has been given to me. And it occurred to me in this amazing moment that perhaps the reason a sacrifice of Thanksgiving may not have any leftovers is that if you have leftovers, it means you're not genuinely grateful. Because if you're genuinely grateful, you will invite guests who need food and serve them. That to me was like an enormous revelation. And by the way, in the history of Protestant Christian anti-Judaic tropes, right? Here you have a moment where precisely the laws of sacrifice are the site of radical ethics, right? Also, of course, the book of Leviticus is the site of love your neighbor as yourself. I mean, so the point is not, should not be shocking, but for a certain period in the 19th century, it would have been a shocking point to make. That's just an example of a biblical text, just reading carefully and admitting what I didn't understand enabled me to find, just real new beauty in the text that I had missed before.
That's excellent. We actually, and I mentioned this before, been using your book amongst a few others in a series with my group at the university on the Torah, and we used that essay in Leviticus because I was like, look at this, like, because it's the classic thing of, okay, let's just move through these laws. I don't see what's
right,
and but look, there's something here that we would never spot, and that's the helpful of reading, across traditions and from. And having a book such as yourself in one's hand. It was really great for us.
It's kind of amazing because what was interesting is as I was working on that essay, I also discovered that the Christian theologian Miroslav Volf writes in very similar ways about the nature of gratitude. I was struck by, images he uses about how we are supposed to be midpoints, right? The gift flows not alone to us, but also through us. And then, of course, struck by the fact that that image is all over the Kabbalah, the notion that we are supposed to be sites where the river of God's gifts, as it were, flows through us. And it is a kind of spiritual failing to become a dam, right? To be that which dams up the water. So the sort of interpenetration there of Jewish and Christian ideas, perhaps not surprisingly, but yet, delightfully, is quite deep.
Yes, that's excellent. Well, kind of staying with this area is you often throughout the book find these kind of depth and theological truths in perhaps unexpected places. When you come to the census in Numbers, you're going to talk about how, like, at first glance appears like a boring reading, very repetitive language, very structured. But as you write, captures an important Jewish theological claim that individuals matter. Or when you talk about the utterly foreign, eye glaze inducing nature of Leviticus, it kind of, nevertheless, you find in there the teaching to Israel that they need to, participate in God's ordering of the world, and by participating in that, sustain the world. You kind of were touching on this before, but what is how have you developed the process to, I guess, this close reading, this looking in where we might be quick to just kind of, let's speed up the pages till we get to the next juicy narrative. Or how finding these gems, like what's your, I guess, your tips, your lesson for those who are looking in a similar way, hoping to find this? Is it the reading in community? Is it the reading with the tradition? What's your thoughts there?
Well, it's interesting. I maybe I'll begin with a slightly autobiographical answer that may be of some interest, which is, my late father was a professor of biblical studies at Columbia University, but a philologist, a Semitic philologist. He was not particularly interested in the world of ideas. He was obsessed with figuring out what words that had remained obscure originally meant. This was his great love. He was a linguist at heart. And although the questions that I bring to texts are radically different, they're philosophical, theological questions, not philological ones. Some of my most formative memories are of him sitting over a desk, staring at a word, obsessively trying to figure out, what does this root in Hebrew mean? I have to understand what this means. I used to joke that if you grew up in my house, you could be forgiven the belief that the meaning of a particular Hebrew root, nothing less than the future of the cosmos, was at stake in getting it right. That was what it was like to grow up with my father. And that really taught me, really by example. My father never talked about that. He was not didactic about it at all. But I saw what it meant to love a text so much that you read it with great care. And I would say, that in a way, in part in my mind, grows out of Jewish culture. Although I did not grow up in an Orthodox home, I did go to Orthodox Jewish schools in which from a very young age, I was taught to study Talmud, and Talmud is all about close reading. You learn to read closer and closer and closer. And I have, for better and for worse, I would say, I'm not sure this is always a virtue, but for better and for worse, I have taken that mode of reading into pretty much everything that I read. It certainly helps you if you're trying to figure out what on earth Kant is talking about in a particular passage, right? To read incredibly slowly, to be willing to read the same sentence 4 times, to parse it different ways. So that's really, it's funny, as almost unhelpful as this is, the first rule is to read slowly. I always tell students at Hadar, the institute that I run, that the first rule of reading the Bible, or really any text, is however slowly you read by nature, you have to train yourself to read more slowly. That the kind of impulse to speed up, it may be useful in certain domains, but when it comes to really kind of loving a text, really kind of engaging with it, getting to know it, coming to love it, it's all about being willing to read slowly. That is really the core of it for me. And it's not about, for me at least, it's not about covering vast amounts of ground. I would be perfectly happy to write an essay about what 2 words mean if I felt that insight could be found there.
Yeah, that's great. And I think that's such a thing today as well, where we're given things at an increasing pace. You're able to get here, let's pack as much into the news headline or the news tweet, so you don't necessarily have to read the article. You can get enough and form your opinion from there. To slow down and really read what is presented before you is a particularly, I think, important virtue in this time.
Yeah, I would say slow, careful, discerning reading is an act of counterculture. Or if you want to put it in a different way, I think devotional reading is deeply countercultural, right? It is really the opposite of watching 46 headlines scroll across your screen at all time. It's a very different form of reading. It's, Heschel talks about in the context, Abraham Joshua Heschel talks in the context of prayer, that part of what it means to know how to pray is to linger upon a word. In our culture, we don't linger upon words when we read. Not the way we're taught to read in this day and age, I don't think. And I think, Jewish reading is all about lingering upon words.
That's great. So jumping back a bit, I was ready to recommend your book from the introduction. I'd read the introduction, I'm so the very opposite of slow and careful reading. I was already everyone read this book. But I want to kind of dive into a few of your kind of overarching points in the introduction and just having some discussion around that. So early on, you write that biblical texts tell a story about a God who loves. But interesting, highlighting that there are 3, I guess, clarifiers of this love, that the love is a grace, and so there's no room for arrogance, that this love does not remove moral responsibility, and this love it exceeds the community, drawing on the story of Hagar here for that. Love is such a tricky word in our times. It's co-opting into commerce and it's collapsing into romance. Really makes it a difficult concept to grasp. And you explore that further in your essay on Leviticus 19:18, on love your neighbor as yourself. when love is so central to understanding what is going on when we read these books, but so easily robbed of its depth, how do you instruct and guide those who are trying to grasp what it means to understand God's love, or what it means to love God and neighbor? That word, which is, we should have more words for this one word, it seems, in English, but it collapses down quite quickly.
Wow. Well, that is as big a question as there is. And I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but the book I'm actually writing now is about the centrality of love in Jewish theology and ethics and spirituality. That's really what I'm trying to get at. And part of that, just some context there, is that it seems to me historically that at a certain point, I'm not sure I could trace when, I'm not an intellectual historian, that's not really my project, but at a certain point, many Jews internalized the traditional anti-Judaic claim of the Christian church that Judaism was loveless, right? The historian David Nirenberg has written that Christianity and its medieval polemics against Islam and Judaism, that its central claim against them was lovelessness. And it seems to me that for reasons that are maybe a discussion for another time, some Jews internalized that and began to say things like Christianity is about love, Judaism is about something else, justice, obeying the will of God, discipline, whatever it might be. And I think Judaism is about all those things, but it is also about love. And in fact, one of Judaism's most radical claims, I think, is that many of those things are themselves manifestations of love. In many ways, one of the chapters I hope to work on last in the book I'm working on now is the ways in which I think the greatest misapprehension of Judaism in the West actually is Luther's misapprehension of what law means to Jews. The notion that law is itself a manifestation of divine love, right? That God loves you so much that God gives you a path through the world is, I think, an enormously powerful idea. And I'm trying in all kinds of ways to reclaim the language of love. And of course, ironically, there are times when people say to me, "Oh, you sound like a Christian," to which my response in Jewish settings is usually, well, where do you think they got it from? Right? I mean, where do you think the notion of divine love comes from? Because Christians also read the book of Hosea, right? Christians also read the book of Deuteronomy. Now, but to your question, which was really about Western culture, and I think it's a very powerful question, love, and I find this as I now kind of travel around a lot and talk about theological approaches to love, you learn the extent to which, first of all, love has been sentimentalized as a word. So it's sort of, you say the word love and people assume that you're an employee of the Hallmark card company, right? It's this kind of, and so to say that love is emotional, but is not only emotional, it is actional, but it is not only actional. The language that I use, which is perhaps pretentious, but I haven't found a better formulation yet, is that the kind of love that I think that Judaism is talking about is love as an existential posture, a way of holding yourself in the world, a way of comporting oneself that involves emotion, genuine care about others, that involves action. If Jewish law emphasizes one thing in the interpersonal realm, it's that caring about people without acting concretely to help them is meaningless and may even be narcissistic. But you are right that I think not only do we have to reclaim the word love, but we really have to clarify what we mean by it, right? We have a lot of work of definition to do. It's interesting also, I mean, this is perhaps a digression, but I think that this conversation is taking place in a variety of areas as well. One of the things that I've noticed is that also in Western philosophy and in ethics now, all of a sudden there's a major discussion on what do we mean by love. Martha Nussbaum's work on love as a political virtue, how we need love to have a functioning political society. A radical, interesting claim, very different than, the kind of like Rawlsian notion of what the state looks like. We have people trying to explore the meaning of love in questions of interpersonal ethics. There's just a lot of kind of bubbling to the surface now of, I think, a sense that we need to reclaim love. And when we talk about it in Western society, we tend to talk about it very clumsily, or worse, in cliched ways. And I think we need something much deeper than that. I mean, if I could go on for just one moment, I'll say that I think something that's important to me here to say, and I think this is true about love and about gratitude and about many other virtues as well. One of the reasons it's important to talk about these ideas as existential postures and not emotions is that emotions come and go. No one feels grateful all the time, and no one loves their spouse in an overflowing emotional way 24 hours a day. Now, if you don't love your spouse emotionally ever, your existential posture, your existential commitment may very well fade. But the goal is not to feel something at every moment. The goal is to have a commitment that is both buttressed by and itself buttresses the feeling. But the commitment is different. It's more existential and fundamental. That's what I think Love Your Neighbor is ultimately about. It's about cultivating the posture of caring about other people. And caring is maybe a good word there because it is about caring in the sense of acting, caring in the sense of feeling, but care as a more general existential posture so that even when I don't feel anything, I act in caring ways. And again, the same is true, I think, with gratitude. It's not about feeling grateful at every moment. It's about having a posture of being aware that life is a gift. Since this is a Christian podcast, to use Augustine's phrase, the realization that we did not create ourselves, right? That is really at the heart. That's not a feeling. I mean, it manifests as a feeling, right? But it's a way of understanding my being in the world.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent reframing to this posture and commitment that informs and is sustained by the emotion. Staying with the introduction and moving on from that is, the Jewish theology is grounded in God's love. It is equally focused on human responsibility. Something that resonated with me in this is this kind of dialectic you have, which is holds in tension a kind of a warning against Pollyannish notions of moral progress, that we're all just on one great journey to the good times, while also demanding that covenantal living is about committing to serving God, and when that fails, getting up and trying again. You talk about humanity being enlisted as God's partners and called into the good and the holy, while being warned, don't think you can fix it all yourself and perfect it yourself. Now, again, like in our world, the 19 headlines at once, we are inundated with the kind of the pain and the chaos of our world kind of constantly. So how do you think this dialectic of being called into hopeful, imaginative action while resisting the belief that we can fix it ourselves kind of sustains that commitment, that call to social responsibility and care in a time which can just make us feel overwhelmed?
Right. That's an interesting and hard question. And, we're talking at a moment when here in the United States is a time of great despair, right? Where many of the things we thought we had, much of the progress we thought we had made in this country around issues of race and gender, have been, let's just say, generously called into question over the past 2 years. So it's a time of great hopelessness for a lot of people. I would say a couple of things about this. One is, first, perhaps a very traditional Jewish answer, which I try to write about in the book. And I'll confess, just because I think religion should always be honest and isn't, this is not always true in my own life, to be sure. But one of the most radical kind of spiritual projects that Judaism engages in is the notion that Shabbat, the Sabbath, is an attempt to live in the redeemed future in the present, right? That what I try to do when I observe Shabbat is to live as if everything has already been perfected and redeemed. That's why, for example, although petitionary prayer occupies a central place in Jewish prayer during the week, the tradition is that on the Sabbath, there is no petitionary prayer. We don't ask for things. We live as if we have everything we need. There is something there that I think is intended to be an antidote to hopelessness. I know it seems like we never get anywhere, but do you remember last Shabbat when you were fully present with your children, when you took the time to stop and talk to someone who no one talks to, when you opened your community to people who have no place to go? There's a way in which Shabbat represents a kind of radical counterstatement to the reality that we inhabit day to day. Now, does that always work? Of course not. No ritual always works, right? And, if it works at all, I consider it, a good week. So that's one piece. That's a sort of ritual piece. I think also, one of the things that's very important to me, and actually just today I've been writing about this for the next book, for my next book project, is the ways in which I think, on the one hand, Judaism makes a great deal of space, I think, for protest and lament. There is a room for a kind of sacred indignation at the way the world is broken. And yet there's a real danger that if we cultivate too much indignation or only indignation, we become humorless. Righteousness descends into self-righteousness, and the world becomes just ugly and we become hostile. The question, I think, really is in a world in which there is so much to protest and speak up about, do we also find moments for deep, intimate love, for humor, for laughter, for perhaps, sensing the quiet presence of God? Without that, I think indignation just basically becomes rage. And when indignation becomes rage, we run the risk, if nothing else, of becoming the things that we're protesting about in the first place. So I think there's always the important, you mentioned my use of dialectic. I think it's very much the case that indignation and protest, really without softer qualities like laughter and compassion, ultimately I think is fruitless and has the potential to even become destructive. In one of Martin Luther King's sermons, he talks about how, people believe, I'm going to completely butcher this quote, but, people admire the pursuit of justice, but often find those who pursue it kind of unbearable, because they become so incredibly rigid, and so, unable to, I would say, I don't think he says this in his sermon, but also unable to listen to anyone, right? If all you cultivate is indignation, then you very quickly divide the world into, you basically become a kind of Manichaean, right? Where, the people who agree with me are God's people and the people who don't are benighted and evil and simply need to be defeated. And that's also a very unhealthy way to live. I'm sorry for that very rambling answer, but.
Oh, that was great. No, thank you so much. And it was good to have that kind of grounding in, both the ritual and in this idea of cultivating the emotion. So thank you for that. Something you touch on in a number of essays in the book is that how figures in the Torah come to be received in Jewish tradition as archetypes or paragons of particular virtues or vices. So that Moses is this kind of paragon of humility, right. Abraham of hospitality. And from that, then a lot of interesting readings emerge. For instance, how a humble Moses stands starkly in contrast from a Pharaoh who claims the Nile for himself. Or how right. Rebecca can be seen as the heir to Abraham in many ways. So can you maybe explore, for those of us who've never kind of encountered this before, a bit of this, finding these archetypes and maybe some of the benefits you found to this kind of reading, both approaching Torah and when shaping a life when living a life shaped by Scripture?
In recent years, I've become more interested, both in terms of an intellectual pursuit, but also a spiritual one, in the question of virtue ethics and the cultivation of character. I've been teaching a lot lately about this notion in Maimonides, the greatest of the medieval Jewish philosophers, that repentance, tshuva, is not just about thinking about the ways I've behaved and trying to repair my ways, but is also about a deep interrogation of my character, that I look at what are the aspects of the way I am in the world that are problematic and really trying to repair that. That too, to go back to where you were talking earlier, strikes me as a radically countercultural commitment. I don't think we live in a world in which the notion of working on myself has that much purchase in popular culture. And yet I think it's really integral to what spiritual life, I think actually both in Judaism and in Christianity, are intended to be about. Every couple of years, I go spend a morning looking at the self-help section of a bookstore, mainly because I find it fascinating to see what people are thinking about, asking about, struggling with. And although I fear this might sound cloying, I'm often struck by how many more books there are about how to be happy than there are about how to be kind. And the ways in which I think religion needs to resist that, and underscore that at the end of the day, if you are not growing in kindness, you are not on any spiritual path of any kind. You are not serving God if you are not growing kinder. What does it mean to take that to heart and to really live in that way? Now, that, I would say, in a way that was completely unconscious, that I think is part of what led me to become interested in the ways that rabbinic tradition sometimes picks up on character traits that we find in the Bible and accentuates them, kind of drawing a fuller, more lively portrait of a person as a paragon. So as you mentioned, Moses as the model of humility. And it's a complicated picture of humility that raises, I think, fascinating possibilities. Humility there is certainly not passivity. It's not meekness, right? Moses is radically assertive, right? So one of the things that I like about thinking about virtues in the context of stories is that the pictures of the virtues we get tend to be richer and have more dimensions than just a kind of discursive, here's what it would mean today, boys and girls, to become more compassionate. But rather, let's look at this person. On the one hand, we're told that he or she is a model of compassion, and yet this, and what about that? And let's look at this story, and let's look at that story. It's the way in which I think narrative in general, makes for richer conversation and more multifaceted examination. In the book, if I recall, I talk about Rachel as model of compassion, right? Why Rachel's cries pierce the heavens in the language of Midrash. And there's a good example, because when you encounter her story, you realize that this is someone who is struggling to be compassionate precisely at a moment when she herself is in great pain. And I think it doesn't take, it doesn't take an advanced degree in psychology to realize that it's far harder to be compassionate when you're consumed with your own suffering. And that raises, I think, really important questions, right? I mean, what does it mean to be committed to be compassionate even when you're hurting? Another example of that I talk about in the book is when God asks Job to pray for Job's friends who have just so dramatically wounded him. What does it mean to pray for someone, which presumably you're asked to pray sincerely, not just to go through the motions? Pray for someone who's just made you feel more alone, more abandoned, more hurt than you were before. So I guess I would just say that narrative and story allow us to have a much richer exploration of what the virtues are. Now, I just want to add, though, in light of your question, that I think one of the things that you find in some Jewish writing that I think is really salutary, though certainly not in all, is a willingness and sometimes even an eagerness to portray heroic characters, warts and all. That is to say, God does not covenant with perfect saints. God covenants with Jacob. I mean, this is the opposite of a perfect saint, right? This is a kind of conniving, often dishonest, deeply problematic character. And there's something there that, on the one hand, you can ask all kinds of theological questions. Why would God covenant with him? On the other hand, you can read a text like that and think, well, if God, has chosen Jacob, maybe God has something in mind for me too. Right? And I think there's something very powerful about that, about, Jews seeing their heroes as human beings. And of course, like in any culture, there are also countervailing voices that want to purify every biblical character and make, them a kind of perfect saint who, has no other qualities. But that's at any rate not the strand of tradition that I'm drawn to, and I'm not even sure it's the central strand.
Yes, it is a fascinating balance, even in scripture, where you have the Samuel and Kings presentation of that narrative and David, and then the Chronicle one, which adapts certain narratives because of that. But I think you're right. The prevailing one is to go, well, no, if this is who they are, as all who they are, and how can we learn from that, is one that really captures readers in such a strong way too.
Yeah, well, and I think that is really a core aspect of covenant theology, which is that God covenants with human beings, not with angels. God covenants with people. That is the biblical claim. And, you could be forgiven at certain moments, the sense that, has God made a crazy choice? Human beings are difficult. They're stubborn, they're impossible. The Bible is all about disobedience and, stubborn stiff-neckedness and all of that. And yet that is the great covenantal gamble that God engages in from a biblical perspective, which is, no, I want you with all of your, if I may use a Jewish word, with all of your mishigas, with all of your craziness, with all of your, all of your conflicting impulses.
Yeah, thank you. That's excellent. Just a couple more questions. An essay, which I think has some relevance, I guess, for how, for me, as we're using this book to lead students in a year-long series, is this in Bimidbar 2, A Torah for All, Universalism and Its Dangers. In this, you explore kind of two strains of rabbinic thought on the relationship of the Torah and its study to the nations, one particular, one more universal.
Right.
Could you talk a little to this chapter and maybe how you explore the benefits and dangers of each position? And I guess your thoughts on this debate or this discussion in an increasingly pluralistic, multicultural, interreligious world.
Right. Well, yeah, there's a lot to say here. So maybe let me try to sort of say this kind of conceptually first, which is, I think that there is a tendency among some people to conflate universalism and pluralism, whereas in fact those two things can often be at loggerheads with one another. Because very often, certainly in the history of religion, universalism has come hand in hand with a kind of imperialism. That is to say, because I care about everyone, I insist that I know what's best for everyone. And particularism has actually often been richer, more fertile ground for pluralism, because if I am not out to make everyone like me, then in very obvious ways, I can leave other people alone and let them be who they want to be. The rabbinic tradition, I would say that the more dominant strand in this way is particularist, in that it does not have the sense that everyone needs to be a Jew. That's one of the kind of really dramatic differences historically between Judaism and Christianity. And yet there's this fascinating strand that I draw out in that essay that says, well, what do you mean? If the Torah is God's gift and it's God's truth, then obviously it's intended for all of humanity. And when Gentiles die and stand before the heavenly court, they'll be asked about why they weren't students of Torah. And you have this dramatic, these two voices, one voice that says, wait a minute, Torah is the intimate possession of a private covenant between God and Israel. I don't want anybody else there. Then this other voice that says, well, what do you mean? Torah is God's gift, so I want everybody there. Now, where I think this has interesting implications in the context of Judaism and Christianity is you see, I think, both what is most powerful and most potentially dangerous about each tradition's way of thinking. Judaism has historically excelled at leaving people alone, right? It did not have imperial ambitions. And yet the danger in certain moments of Jewish theology is that Jewish theology kind of forgets that other people matter too. It becomes so focused on its intimate covenant with God that it forgets about others. Christianity, on the other hand, has always excelled about remembering other people, but it has taken it thousands of years to even consider leaving anyone else alone, right? And that is why, I mean, if I can put a point, as something of an amateur historian of Christianity, if I can put a point crudely, right? The history of Christian love has so many dead bodies in its wake, right? Because I have this universalist mission, therefore I will conquer the world. In that sense, Christianity and Islam are more similar to each other than either is to Judaism. I say that here not as an issue about superiority or inferiority, but just in terms of thinking about the kind of the inner logic of the tradition. Judaism is more focused, I would say, on quote unquote purifying a particular parcel of land theologically, with dangerous possibilities there too. Christianity and Islam are more universalist religions and therefore, historically at least, more violent ones. Historically, right? So that I think is really fascinating, and it raises the interesting question, I think, of, can we have a pluralist universalism? And maybe I can put it differently. Can we have a pluralist universalism that doesn't depend on vitiated beliefs, right? I trim my sails, you trim your sails, and let's not really believe in anything all that much so we can all get along nicely. But can we have a kind of robust set of religious commitments that also truly makes space for the other? And then I, as a Jewish writer, try to emphasize in this essay how central it is to biblical theology to also remember that God has plans with other peoples too, and that universalism is at the heart of the biblical story. I don't remember whether I talk about it in this book, in the Heart of Torah, but I talk about it in the one that I'm writing now. It is really striking that in the ancient Near East, cultures tended to tell creation stories which culminated in the creation of the culture telling the story. So that the Babylonian creation story, the Enuma Elish, culminates in the creation of Babylonia and its king. Ancient Israel does something wildly subversive, right? It tells a creation story in which ancient Israel plays no part. Israel does not declare itself primordial. God creates humanity and the earth, not the people of Israel and the land of Israel. That is about laying out what one noted Bible scholar calls the universal horizon of biblical particularism, right? The Bible will narrow its lens and talk about Israel and center its attentions there, but not before making clear, before you meet Abraham, you must get to know Adam. Because the fundamental truth is that all human beings are created in God's image and descended from the same parent.
That's excellent. And I think, I think that's so much what we need now is that, having robust beliefs, understanding there are particularities, that it's not all wandering up a mountain and we're slowly getting closer to one kind of truth where we're all the same kind of right. But there's space for working for the common good and particularity. So thank you for that. A final question for a final essay I want to focus on is Between God and Torah, Judaism's Gamble. Here you write that insisting that God's will and presence could be found in Torah was one of Judaism's greatest innovations and achievements. It was also one of its greatest gambles. In this essay, you're demonstrating at both a historical and a personal level the preciousness of this love and confidence in Torah, especially in times when God seems entirely absent. But of course, a gamble is not without its risks, which you identify as allowing that which mediates God to displace God. How have you personally found walking this wire as someone with such a deep knowledge and evident love for Torah, but also someone who, it appears, uses that love to fuel the journey back again and again to the fire at the mountain of God?
One of the phrases I use in that essay that sort of came to me as I was writing it, and I think captures something that has been existentially and spiritually very important to me, is the notion of what I call a textual cord uniting heaven and earth. In moments in my own life, and there are many, in which I feel I don't have access to God, in which my metaphysical doubts are overwhelming, there is very often something for me about simply opening a biblical or rabbinic text, and to go back to where we were earlier, reading it slowly, savoring it, wrestling with it, that feels, I really actually don't know how to say it. It feels like in those moments, it's as close as I come to having a sense of God being in the room with me. In the introduction, I talk about a passage in one of Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel's books that is really a throwaway line of his, but that has been just enormously influential for me, where he says something like, the central question for us is not Torah from heaven, but rather heaven from the Torah. And it is only because of our experiences of the latter that we consider the possibility of the former. For me, that's enormously powerful. And I think I said this even in the introduction, one of my deepest and most basic hopes in writing these essays was that my readers would have moments of feeling that too, of encountering heaven from the Torah and through that, discovering Torah as a kind of vehicle for an ongoing relationship with and conversation with God. It is true, as I wrote in that essay, and as you, I think, correctly, draw attention to, that there is a risk anytime something is seen to mediate God. There are ways in which the mediator can end up serving not as a mediator, but as a substitute. And I think, especially in moments of great doubt, that I think something not dissimilar is true about Jewish law, in that, the rabbinic tradition made this really fascinating gamble. On the one hand, it insists that God can be known in and even brought into every detail of a human life. And when that works, it is enormously powerful. The danger, of course, is that the preoccupation with details comes to substitute for God instead of being a vehicle for bringing God in. Any mediator, any spiritual practice that is a mediation, runs the risk, right, of becoming a substitute. I mean, in a very different idiom, I think of a couple of conversations I've had over the years with Christian students who have said things to me like, I feel like I've been taught to focus so much on Christ that I have no idea what relationship, if any, I have with God the Father. There's something there that I think is religion. And Christ is more than a mediator for Christians, obviously, but there's something parallel there about losing that which stands beyond by embracing that which is supposed to stand between. In my own life, I would say, it is enormously powerful. It is really at the very heart of Jewish spirituality, the notion of manifesting love for God by reading texts. Devotional learning is just an enormously powerful undertaking. And I would say, and maybe this is like, an interesting note to end on after having talked for a long time, to me, it is such a powerful undertaking that I can't begin to articulate the ways that it works for me, right? It is the paradox, of course, of encountering so many words just so we get to the point of realizing how little we can actually say. There's something about learning Torah that is very much that for me.
Yeah, that's a perfect spot to end. Rabbi Shai Held, thank you so much for joining us today. Is there anything you want to promote? Anything, ways people can connect with you and your work? The Hadar Institute? Like
I certainly would invite people to visit the website, www.hadar.org, in which there are thousands and thousands of hours of biblical, Talmudic, philosophical lectures, classes. There's an awful lot of stuff to play around with, engage with, and I hope people will enjoy themselves and feel welcome and invited to be part of it. By the way, just for your future podcast, my name is pronounced Shai.
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay, no problem. Totally fine. Just fix it if you can. Totally fine. Don't feel bad. That's fine. It is spelled Shay, so it's not surprising you said that. But by the way, that actually is a very funny way to end. Why is my name spelled the way it is? Because my father was a philologist and insisted that AI was the way in English to communicate the sound in Hebrew, I. Whatever. Okay? That means that whenever I go into a non-Jewish setting, people are like, wait, how do I say this name?
Yeah.
So, anyway.
Well, Rabbi Shai Held, thank you very much. Everyone go out and get the Heart of Torah, Volume 1, Genesis and Exodus, and Volume 2, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. They will change your reading of the Torah, your preaching of the Torah, your discussion of the Torah, and I cannot recommend them more heartily. Rabbi, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.